CNT125 switches and VLANs lab. The first podcast, we got everything connected and we got IP addresses on all the workstations, and we verified connectivity with some pings throughout. So we have our basic switch network up and functioning. We are now going to actually connect into the switches and start configuring some parameters on the switch. So first thing I'm going to do is connect into the switch. This will be just like I did in the routers. I'm going to click on the switch, go to the CLI tab, hit the enter key a couple times, and you'll notice I'm in a prompt that looks just like the router, so I'm going to use enable. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself there. I'll do enable, just like in the router. And I can do config T or configure terminal, and I'm in configuration mode, just like the router. So I'm going to give it a name. So host name. On this one, let me get my map handy. We're going to call this guy over here floor 1 switch, and we'll call this one floor 2. So I'm going to use a name like 2960 floor 1. Now you'll notice I actually put in the underscore. You wouldn't have to. You could do this and put it all together. Floor 1, you could do that as well. Either one would be fine. Sometimes people like to use the underscore so it's a visual space. Either one will work. But I do want to denote these as like this would be the switch on floor 1 and the other router would be, or the other switch would be the switch on floor 2. So now that I've given it a name, just like the router, I'm now going to put an IP address on the switch. Now, real quickly, these are layer 2 switches. Layer 2 switches do not read and make path decisions on IP addresses. They're not able to. It's a layer 2 switch. However, I am going to put a single IP address on this switch, a single IP address. And the reason I would do this is for management purposes. If you remember the remote access lab we did last week, where we remotely connected to the routers using Telnet SSH, well, if I put an IP address on this switch, I can SSH or Telnet into it. We would prefer SSH, but I can remote into it using this IP address. Okay, so as I do this, there's only one. I can only put one IP address on the whole switch. So don't get, in a mindset of trying to put multiple IPs on like we did a router. It is not able to do that. The second thing is we're going to put it on VLAN 1. There is a default VLAN on here. Let me show you this. Show VLAN. There's a default VLAN on this switch that all ports belong to by default. So I'm setting the IP address on this default VLAN for all these ports. That's just what you do. So it's going to look like this. I'm going to say interface VLAN 1. Oops, if I type correctly, interface VLAN 1, there we go. And you notice it goes to config F. I will set the IP address, and I'm going to get this from my map. So let me get my map handy. This switch I'm going to use 101. This switch I'll use 102. They need to be in the same network, but I can't conflict. I can't have them both use the same IP address. So 172.16.1.101 for this guy, followed by the subnet mask. And just like the router, I'm going to say no shutdown to turn this on so it actually would recognize that IP address. So if I exit out and do a show run, just like I do on a router, here are all the switch ports. And down here at the bottom, I see the IP address assigned to interface VLAN 1. That's it. That's the only IP I'm going to put on this thing. That's it. Okay? I am not going to try to put others on. It is not a router. It's not a layer 3 switch. It's a layer 2 switch. You can only have one IP address. Okay. So there is my IP address on the switch, ready to go. I'm going to repeat this for the other switch. So I'm going to go over here. Let me close this out. I'll go to this switch. CLI, enable, config T. Let's give this a host name. We'll do 2960 floor 2. I also need to do interface VLAN 1, IP address 172.16.1.102. I don't want to conflict the first switch. And no shutdown. exit, exit. I can do a show run on this one. There's all my ports. Down here's the IP address. It's unique from the other switch. Okay? So both switches now have a name and they have an IP address. I don't have this written into the lab, but since everything is on VLAN 1, I could actually now, in here in the command prompt, I could actually ping the switch 172.16.1.101. I could actually ping this first switch, and then I could also ping the other switch. And if I were to configure remote access, I could remote into it. And there's 102, here's the other switch. Now, after we put VLANs on, this won't work. But right now, everything's in VLAN 1, so we can do this. Okay? I didn't write that in. That's just a little extra for hanging in there and watching my podcasts. All right. So there is the name and the IP address on both switch. Okay. Let's now create the VLANs. So I'm going to go back to, I will close this guy out. I'm going to go back to my first floor switch. I'm now going to create the VLANs on my switch. And I'm going to do it by number. And then I'm going to give it a name for us humans. Okay. So on here, on this switch, let's get to our command prompt, config T. We want to say VLAN, and we use a number to denote these. We're going to use a number to denote this. That's what switches and other things understand. They understand numbers, not names. So I'm going to create VLAN 10 wired. I'm going to create VLAN 20 voice over IP, and I'm going to create VLAN 30 Wi-Fi. That's the three I'm going to create. So I'm going to say VLAN 10, and it's going to go into VLAN mode, and I can now give it a name. And I can call it wired. And that would be like all the desktop computers in here. I'm going to say VLAN 20, name, this one I said voice over IP, and VLAN 30, name, I'll call it Wi-Fi. So there's my three VLANs created. If I were to do a show run, I don't see them. Nothing's been done with them. But if I do a show VLAN shows the VLAN table. And what I see is those three are here by number and by name, ready to go. Okay, so I'm actually going to, while I'm at it, I'll just jump over to the other switch and I'll do the same thing again over here. Config T, VLAN 10, name wired, VLAN 20, name voice over IP, VLAN 30, name Wi-Fi, and again exit exit. If I do a show run, they won't show up because we haven't done anything with them, but they will show on the VLAN table. So if I do a show VLAN, I will see them here as well. Okay, and consistency here is going to matter. Consistency is going to matter because VLAN 10 on this switch could talk to VLAN 10 over here as long as I'm consistent. The number is what matters. The number is what matters. Okay, so I have VLANs created on both switches, and I just did a show VLAN to show that. Now, let's take some ports, and we're going to put ports in each VLAN. I'm going to take a range of ports and put them into a VLAN. And I'm going to do this with a command called interface range. Okay, so I'll go back to my first floor switch. And on here, we're going to use the command, as it shows you here, interface range. So config T, interface range. And it says, okay, what port range do you want to use? Well, these are fast Ethernet ports, so we're going to say port 1, and they denote them fast Ethernet 0/1. That's port 1. Port 1 space dash space 2, whatever ending port we want to use. Well, if I look at my map, we are doing ports 1 to 10 for wired, 11 to 20 for voice over IP, and 21 and 22 for the Wi-Fi. So the first range, fast Ethernet 0/1 space dash space 10, I'm going to say these ports, switch port access VLAN 10. I'm going to say these ports, that range of ports, are going to get assigned to VLAN 10. And it goes, okay. So I'm going to do exit, and I'm going to use the up arrow, and I can pull up this switch or this interface range command, and I can edit it and say, okay, I want to do 11 space dash space 20. It says, okay, up arrow, access VLAN 20. exit, up arrow, and I want to do 21 to 22. Switchboard access VLAN 30. Exit, exit. Okay, so I've just done the range for the VLAN 10, range for VLAN 20, range for VLAN 30. And what I should be able to do is do show run. And if I hit the space bar, I'm going to start seeing under these ports that they belong to certain VLANs. 10, 20, 30. And I can also do a show VLAN. Sometimes this is a little more visual for people that are visually minded. And I can see wired VLAN, ports 1 to 10, voice over IP VLAN, 11 to 20, and Wi-Fi is 21 to 22. So that switch, the ports have been assigned to the VLANs. Well, let's repeat that on this switch over here. Practice. Config T, interface range, FA 0/1, 0/1, space, dash, space, 10. And we want to do switch port access VLAN 10. Exit, up arrow. We'll make this 11 to 20. Switch ports access VLAN 20. Exit. Switch port, we want 21 to 22. Switch port access VLAN 30. Exit, exit. Show run. I should see these under my ports. And I should be able to do show VLAN and see all of my ports associated to the correct VLANs. VLAN 10, there's 1 to 10. VLAN 20, 11 to 20. VLAN 30, 21, 22. Yahoo! So I've created the VLANs by number and name, and then I've taken groups of ports and associated them to VLANs. And I just took a little minute and looked at the running config and the VLAN table on both. And before I go any further, I'm going to save my config. So coming back here to this switch, okay, I will do the copy, run, start, just like I did on the router. So that has been saved. And I'll go to this one, and I will do copy, run, start on this guy as well. My config has been saved. And I might want to, before I get too much further, I might want to do the whole file save as on my packet tracer file here, and do something like, Brown VLAN lab packet tracer, and just save that way I have this saved that I'll be able to submit later. Something as simple as that. Alright, so I've saved my configs on both switches, and I just saved my packet tracer file so I don't lose any progress as I go here. Excellent. Now that we have VLANs created on the switches, configured on the switches, we're now going to be able to do some testing with our clients. I'm going to come back in the next podcast and walk you through our testing.